Nation building is a never-ending process. No country in the world can say it has finished its nation building project. That is why Ethiopians have started discussing the issue. Recently, a 2-day-long symposium was held in Bishoftu town under the theme Nation Building in Ethiopia, the Quest for an Enduring Direction. On the symposium, Ethiopian scholars, politicians, members of private sector and others have participated and discussed the topic in detail. In the last week edition of EBC Special, we have presented their discussion that primarily focused on the country's nation-building process under the 3 regimes, relating it with the current happenings. In this edition of the program, we'll bring you the experience of other countries like Nigeria that have similar characteristics with Ethiopia in terms of ethnic and religious diversities. Professor Adebayo Olukoshi is a Nigerian scholar that has vast knowledge on nation building and other related issues on the African continent. He emphasizes the need to seriously consider pluralism as an important foundation in the nation-building process.
Almost without exception, people cite Somalia, and I think we can probably have a debate on it. Across the continent, independence was achieved on the basis of pluralisms, not just one pluralism, pluralisms. Pluralisms which may not have been necessarily politicized at the beginning, but which eventually also became part and parcel of a process of politicization. Ethnic pluralism, sometimes coinciding with regional diversities, religious diversities, and all of the other diversities which we know, and which in the early conception of nation building on the continent was sometimes seen as a disadvantage, not an advantage. And the idea that we needed to be homogenized, almost in the way in which it was done in Europe. And in Europe, it was not always a peaceful democratic process. There was a lot of force which was used to compel people to conform to the idea of the nation as captured by the majority ethnic population of many of the countries of Europe. And the process also left quite a good number of nations at the end of it all stateless, battles which are still being fought out in parts of Europe. But nevertheless, we had a drive almost across the continent. Recall Nyerere again. Our 3 dragons, one of them, number 1, tribalism. Eliminate tribalism. We must wipe out. I mean, it's a very funny concept in its own right, but we must wipe out ethnicity and homogenize the country. And it produced policy outcomes of the kind in which, for example, growing up in northern Nigeria and going to primary school, I actually would have, like many of my generation, our heads knocked at school and punished for violating the code that you are not supposed to speak vernacular. The idea that I would speak Yoruba or Hausa to a fellow classmate in northern Nigeria in the first decade of independence was highly problematic. You are supposed to speak English. That's the national official language. And so at home we all spoke our different mother tongues. You come to school, you must discipline yourself and recognize that you are not supposed to speak in anything other than English because everything else was considered to be vernacular. A process of homogenization that played out at different levels, but which eventually was also to run its course.
He also argues that the concept of citizenship should be encouraged and celebrated in the multi-ethnic and multicultural nations of Africa, including Ethiopia.
If you know Nigeria, Adebayo Olukoshi will tell you straight away that I'm from a Yoruba-speaking part of Nigeria. You will be partially correct, because I grew up in northern Nigeria, which in crude terms, will be described as Hausa speaking. But yes, I'm also the product of a mixed heritage, of a Yoruba father and of a Fulani mother. Grew up in Kaduna, and yet, as Richard will attest, if I wanted today to hold political office in Nigeria as an elected official, I might well be told to go back to Kogi State, which I have only ever visited once in my life, having lived in Kaduna all of my life and did all of my education to the first degree in northern Nigeria. Kaduna, Sokoto, spoke better Hausa than Yoruba. And yet people will look at you and say, sorry, you're not from here, go back. And people are debating this in Nigeria today and saying, excuse me, I pay taxes to Kaduna state government. I pay levies to Sokoto state government. How come it is that I cannot aspire to provide leadership services? I may not even be allowed to buy land in some of the most extreme cases, because you must go back to your state of origin. And the reply you get from others is to say, okay, that is fine. To thy tents, O Israel. If this is the rule by which we are operating, we are also demanding resource control. Because all of this nonsense is because the oil is from the Niger Delta. You people are taking the oil. We cannot enjoy the benefits on a pan-Nigerian basis. So you control your groundnuts in Sokoto. We will control our oil in the Niger Delta. Resource control. And one contradiction begins to build into the other. Because somehow, along the line, and it's a long story, there's no time to tell it, we lost the plot about the idea that in nation building, citizenship must be exercised and enjoyed on a pan-territorial basis.
Ethiopian scholars, politicians, members of private sector and others have forwarded questions and suggestions and discussed the issue with the presenter. 2
questions. I'm not going to ask you about Ethiopia. The first one, you said rightly, nation building process or state formation process is a continual process. It's never a one-time process. That's, I think, a very valid point. Taking this important proposition, I would like to ask you about Nigeria. Whenever Nigerian scholars give presentations and we read about Nigeria, it's really very much enigmatic question how Nigeria managed to survive as a united country. So my question is, if nation building process is a continuous process, when Nigeria became independent, some of the most important ideologies or principles, what really worked, what didn't work. So what really explains the resilience of Nigeria as a united country, in spite of all these divisions, corruption, dysfunctionality of the state. The other question, you rightly also mentioned about the tension between ethnic rights, diversity, which in the Nigerian literature people talk about the son of the soil. We in the north need to have all the rights for our own groups and these types of issues, and the issue of overarching Nigerian citizenship. You said this is still a very important challenge in the case of Nigeria. Even this works for Ethiopia. So the question is, what could help us to balance? These are important issues: ethnic rights, self-determination, use of one's language, autonomy, self-administration. They cannot be dismissed. At the same time, if countries are going to survive, it's very important to have overarching Nigerian, Ethiopian, Kenyan citizenship. So what are the most important things countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, and others need to do to have something to balance between the two extreme scenarios? Thank you so much.
And the truth, as I said, even in the most mono-ethnic of nations, there are fractures. There will be other fractures. We are human beings. We will invent other fractures. In Somalia, it's about clans. It's one nation, isn't it? At the end of the day, clans and other factors coming into play. Now, I think it's important that we keep that balance between recognizing difference, but not to a point where difference makes it impossible to govern ourselves. Yeah. That's my key message. If I look at the Nigerian experience, within my own lifetime, we have gone through all kinds of things. From moving to saying one Nigeria is a task that must be done. I was socialized on that slogan. And then the Civil War came. And the head of state at the time was Gawan. And at primary school, we all learned the slogan, go on with one Nigeria, Gawan. And massive investments made to sometimes even propagandistic, to socialize us in one direction. It doesn't work at the end of the day, because the art of governance itself is suffused with so many inconsistencies and contradictions that you will inevitably reawaken those differences. And it is better to find mechanisms that are able to mobilize consensus and compromise in the process of nation and state building that can be elastic enough to preserve unity, even in the most tense of moments. And let's not make any mistake about it. Nation building is not a tension-free process. In fact, I would argue that it is suffused with tension, and we need to also learn to live with some of those tensions.
In a modern nation, human beings have got two dimensions. One is the citizenship aspect that you're focusing mainly. And the other one is the groupings right aspect, the group right aspect. Article 27 of the ICCPR, as of 1966, has also recognized the rights of ethnic, linguistic, and religious groupings, just as groupings, not only as citizens. Well, how would you reconcile these group rights with the citizenship values that you're trying to promote? Thank you very much.
Group rights, and we had a very good experience of that with the Niger Delta in Nigeria, the Ogoni people's movement that started the claim on resource control. Group rights become important in a context where minorities, particularly, have been systematically excluded. And that, in part, was also the story we were dealing with in some parts of the continent. Major ethnic groups dominate the game. Minority ethnic groups are considered completely inconsequential in the bigger equation. And they, too, then have a political awakening, begin to make rights. But I believe that actually the fullness of the rights of those groups, although preserved and reinforced by a special recognition, cannot be fully enjoyed if it is to the exclusion of others. But basically, in order to give a sense of belonging, say, you can, of course, not have a cabinet of ministers drawn from one ethnic group. It's not possible. So the Constitution then says that you must maintain a principle of federal character in political appointments, in which every state is entitled to have a ministerial nominee in cabinet, as the principle of equalizing. And you could go to policy measures like special projects to address uneven development. So there is a problem in northwestern Nigeria. It's the poorest, the most illiterate, and so on. Fertile ground for Boko Haram. No Nigerian will be opposed to the idea today, and it has been done unanimously in the National Assembly, of setting up a Northeast Development Commission that will take special initiatives on infrastructure, water, schools, education, girls, everything. And it has a special budgetary allocation. Now, if they don't embezzle the money, it will make a difference, right?
Yeah, critical.
It was the same thing with the Niger Delta. So there are things which happen, which we can use in order to ensure that group rights are recognized, but do not themselves become a new source of dysfunction.
Nigerian issues of nation building, because it's a country of diversified nations and nationalities, as we know from historical record. I think it is very important to understand the essence of diversity within unity. Actually, India, it says, when I was at the high school, teachers were saying India offers unity in diversity. But these days, offering unity in diversity may not work for Africa or elsewhere, in Europe also, because diversity particularly has to be seen, unity has to be seen within diversity. And these days, diversity within unity is favored, because recognition of diversity leads to the building block of a nation. This is the way I understand. Particularly, I want to utter a question on the political leadership, the kind of political leadership that Africa had experienced and is experiencing. Leaders try to hang on to power, whether they have done something good or something bad to the people, whether they have respected citizenship or diversity. They want to really go on hanging on to power, because Frederick Chabal says, power is a way to wealth, but it is risky in Africa. So what kind of political leadership do you think should be put in place to build a nation on equal footing, equal sharing, resource sharing, values shared in culture, and moving forward, and in terms of equitable sharing of resources in Nigeria, as an example, to the rest of Africa? Thank you very much.
And I would argue that in the context of the fractures we are dealing with across the continent, and I would even argue beyond the continent, in the Balkans, for example, that it is important to find the kind of leadership that has a sense of consensus building and is able to forge compromise. Because, I mean, if you read newspapers in Nigeria, I mean, Obasanjo has a much more positive image outside of Nigeria than in Nigeria. But then they say that a prophet does not have honor in his home. But any Nigerian you ask, regardless of whatever they feel about Obasanjo, will tell you that one thing you can give to Baba, he's a Nigerian. You cannot go to his table and reproach him of being the promoter of a parochial ethnic agenda all his life.
That's a leader.
And that's why they took him out of prison and took him to State House. In the context of the annulment and the division and the threats to unity, the leadership across military and civilian, who is the person we can all trust? And the lot fell on him. And they went to him in prison and said, you are going to have to come and sort out this mess. The military have created a complete mess. Fortunately, you are one of them. But you handed over. This time around, you need to come and sort it out and put Nigeria on a different footing. Nobody will reproach him on those grounds. I think it's possible to find those kinds of leaders. Mandela couldn't be reproached as being the promoter of a COSA agenda. You can reproach him on many other things, but not that he was carrying a flag saying that Cosa Nostra forever. Only Cosas can rule South Africa. It doesn't happen that way. And I think it's important we begin to also invest in the kind of civic education that enables us to have the pan-territorial, the commonalities, that pan-territorial identity.
Professor Richard Joseph is another scholar that has accumulated knowledge on the issue of nation building in Africa. He is an American scholar with Caribbean origin. Richard shared his knowledge on the subject to Ethiopians. After his presentation, discussion went on with scholars, politicians, and people of different backgrounds.
There is a huge transformation that has gone in this country. And generally, I am optimistic that the future is bright. I see opportunities rather than threats. I don't want to go into the details. Of course, there is a great deal of improvement in terms of political space now, rather than, say, 27 years ago. There are so many positive elements, as he has mentioned. I fully agree with his approach of incremental change. But at the same time, my question is, can you tell us a little bit about leadership in such a situation? In a situation where there are opportunities and threats, in a situation where there is a need for fundamental transformation and a leap forward, not only economically, but in terms of political transformation. And at the same time, if there is a leadership which can see more of threats rather than opportunities and becomes exclusive, exclusive to its own exercises rather than opening up. Don't you see a danger of this disruptive transformational process going astray? Thank you very much.
We have experiences. I personally, together with my students and research assistants, I'm hoping to bring in other collaborators. And now going to go back and really distill some of the lessons that we have learned, because we have a lot of that kind of experience, right? And being able to make those understandings available and to have others sharing it. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that these transitional processes, because we have lived through, an era of extraordinary transformations. I mean, those of us who came up in the Cold War era, the transformations. So there is a lot of knowledge. I even have some of my colleagues who are experts on other countries, Spain and Portugal. I mean, there's a whole number of countries, countries in East Asia and so on. And how those processes unfolded in those particular countries, and some of the ideas and some of the concepts and so on, is something that I think can be brought into these conversations.
The two-day symposium has contributed a lot in generating ideas which serve as an input for the expected agreed national document. Similar symposium is vowed to be organized in the future.